There is an office in Omaha, Nebraska, that belongs to one of the wealthiest people who has ever lived. If you were invited into that office, you'd notice something odd about the walls. Warren Buffett holds a degree from the University of Nebraska. He holds another from Columbia Business School, one of the most respected finance programs on earth, where he studied under the man who invented value investing. Neither of those is on the wall. There's a photograph of his father. And there is one framed certificate from a course that cost $100, taught in a rented room in Omaha by an organization named after a man who grew up on a Missouri farm. Buffett has said plainly that it changed his life. He has called it the most important degree he holds. Here's how he got there. At 15, Buffett was not a confident boy. He was struggling to fit in at high school, awkward, out of step, the sort of teenager who reads the room and can't work out how to enter it. He found a book on his grandfather's shelf. The title was so direct, so nakedly aimed at exactly his problem, that he couldn't leave it alone. How to Win Friends and Influence People. He didn't just read it, he started running experiments, trying the techniques on people, watching what happened, noting which ones worked. He did not become charming overnight, but according to his biographer, everything in that book worked on the people he tried it on, and he built it into himself permanently. Years later, at Columbia, he saw a newspaper advertisement for a Dale Carnegie public speaking course. He went to Midtown Manhattan, signed up, and wrote them a check. Then he left the building and stopped payment on it. He was that frightened. This is a man who would go on to command the attention of the entire financial world, and he could not make himself walk into a room and speak. After graduating, he went back to Omaha and took a job selling securities, a job that required him to talk to people constantly. So he found the advertisement again. And this time he did something specific. He didn't write a check. He handed the instructor $100 in cash, because he knew that if the money was already gone, he would have to show up. He showed up. About 30 people were in that room, and by his account, not one of them could get through saying their own name. That certificate is what's hanging on the wall today. So, what's actually in the book? Today we're going through How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. All 30 principles, in the 4 parts Carnegie organized them into, with the stories behind them. It was published in 1936, in the middle of the Great Depression. It has sold somewhere north of 30 million copies. It has never gone out of print in 90 years, and it is still, right now, quietly running underneath most of the interactions you'll have this week, because a huge number of the people you deal with have either read it or been trained by someone who did. And near the end, I'm going to give you the serious case against it, because this book has a real charge to answer, one that thoughtful people have been making since the year it came out, and most breakdowns of it skip that entirely. Stay for that part. It's the difference between using this book well and using it badly. Dale Carnegie was born in 1888 on a farm in Missouri, into genuine poverty. The family lost crops to floods. There were years they had almost nothing. He wanted to be somebody. He tried a few routes. He sold correspondence courses to ranchers. He sold bacon, soap, and lard for a meatpacking company, and he was good at it. He built one of the worst territories in the country into one of the best. He quit anyway to try acting, toured in a play, and discovered he wasn't going to make a living that way either. He ended up broke in New York, sleeping in a cheap room, and went to the IMCA on 125th Street with a proposal. Let him teach a public speaking class in the evenings. They weren't interested. Eventually, they offered him a deal that carried no risk for them at all. No salary, just a cut of whatever the enrollments brought in. If nobody came, he earned nothing. People came. Within a couple of years, he was earning many times what he'd originally asked for. And here's the detail that matters, because it explains the entire shape of this book. As the classes grew, Carnegie went looking for a textbook on handling people, the actual mechanics of getting along with other human beings. There wasn't one. Plenty on grammar, plenty on rhetoric, nothing on the thing every single student in that room actually needed. So he started writing his own, testing every idea on live adults week after week, keeping what worked and cutting what didn't, for something like 15 years before it became a book. That's the unusual thing about how to win friends. It isn't a theory someone had. It's a record of what survived contact with thousands of ordinary people trying to solve real problems at work and at home. Carnegie organizes it into 4 parts, and we're going through all of them. Principle 1. Don't criticize, condemn, or complain. In 1931, New York police cornered a man named Francis Crowley in an apartment on West 91st Street. He was a cop killer. Hundreds of officers surrounded the building, and for over an hour, there was a gun battle across a Manhattan street, with people watching from windows and rooftops. While that was happening, Crowley was writing a letter. He wrote about himself as a man with a tired heart, but a kind one. A man who wouldn't hurt anybody. He had shot a policeman dead for asking to see his license, and in his own account of himself, he was the decent party. Carnegie's point isn't that criminals are deluded, it's that Crowley is not unusual. He's ordinary. The warden of Sing Sing prison told Carnegie that almost none of the men in his prison thought of themselves as bad. They had explanations, reasons, circumstances. Al Capone described himself as someone who had given people a good time and been abused for it. If the most notorious men in America don't blame themselves, what are the odds that your colleague does, or your brother-in-law, or the person who cut you off this morning? Criticism, Carnegie argues, almost never produces change. It produces defense. The person hardens, justifies, and resents you, and now you have the original problem plus a new enemy. His example of the alternative is Abraham Lincoln, who as a young man wrote anonymous letters mocking his opponents until one of them challenged him to a duel and nearly killed him. He never mocked anyone in print again. Years later, after Gettysburg, Lincoln watched General Meade let a beaten Confederate army escape across a flooded river, a decision Lincoln believed had prolonged the war and cost thousands of lives. He sat down and wrote Meade a letter of enormous, controlled fury. Meade never received it. The letter was found among Lincoln's papers after his death. He'd written it, and then he'd thought about what it would actually accomplish, and he put it in a drawer. Principle 2. Give honest, sincere appreciation. Andrew Carnegie, no relation to Dale, paid a man named Charles Schwab a salary of $1 million a year at a time when that was an almost unimaginable sum. Schwab didn't know more about making steel than the men working under him. Many of them knew far more. What Schwab said he was actually being paid for was his ability to get enthusiasm out of people, and the way he did it was by being generous with praise and extremely reluctant to criticize. Carnegie's distinction here is the one people miss, and it's the hinge of the whole book. Appreciation is not flattery. Flattery is telling someone what they want to hear. Appreciation is telling them something true that you noticed and they didn't know you'd noticed. The reason it works is not manipulation, it's scarcity. Almost nobody does it. Think about the last time someone told you specifically what you were good at. For most people, that's a genuinely hard question. Principle 3. Arouse in the other person an eager want. Carnegie liked strawberries and cream. Fish prefer worms. So, when he went fishing, he didn't bait the hook with what he wanted. That sounds obvious, and almost nobody does it. We ask for a raise by explaining what we need. We pitch an idea by explaining why we like it. We try to persuade our children by explaining what we want them to do. Every one of those conversations is baited with strawberries. Carnegie's own example is a hotel ballroom he rented every season to run his lectures in. One year the hotel informed him the rent was going up by 300%, after the tickets were already printed and sold. He went to see the manager, and he did not mention, at any point, that he couldn't afford it, or that it was unfair, or what he wanted. Instead, he drew a line down a sheet of paper and wrote 2 headings, advantages to the hotel and disadvantages to the hotel. Under advantages, he wrote the honest case for the hotel's position. A free ballroom rents out for dances and conventions at far more than he was paying. He was arguing the other side's case for them, accurately. Then the disadvantages. Raising his rent didn't increase the hotel's income from him. It eliminated it, because he'd have to leave. And his lectures were bringing several thousand educated, well-off people through that lobby every season, an audience the hotel could not buy with advertising at any price. He handed the manager the sheet and left. The increase came back at 50% instead of 300. He had never once said what he wanted. He'd spent the entire meeting talking about what the manager wanted. The only reliable way to move another person is to connect what you want to something they already want. Not to fake it, to find the genuine overlap and lead with that. If you can't find one, you probably don't have a case yet. 1. Become genuinely interested in other people. Carnegie's observation is that a dog is the only animal that doesn't have to work for its living. A hen produces eggs, a cow gives milk, a dog gives you nothing but obvious, undisguised delight that you exist, and in exchange people feed it, house it, and love it for its entire life. You can make more friends in 2 months by becoming interested in other people than in 2 years trying to make them interested in you. The maths is not close. 2. Smile. This is the principle that sounds most like a greeting card and holds up better than you'd expect. Carnegie's version is not pretend to be happy. He's borrowing an idea from the psychologist William James, that action and feeling run together, and that by regulating the action, which is under your direct control, you can indirectly reach the feeling, which isn't. Put practically, you can't decide to feel cheerful. You can decide to behave cheerfully, and quite often the feeling catches up. Psychologists have gone back and forth on the strong version of this for decades, and the evidence is messier than the book implies. The much-repeated claim that holding a smile makes you measurably happier has had a rough time in replication. But the social half of the claim isn't really in dispute. People respond to the face you bring into the room, and most people bring the face they had in the last room. A neutral expression that you experience as neutral is frequently experienced by everyone else as displeasure, and they will adjust their behavior toward you accordingly, without ever telling you why. 3. Remember and use people's names. Andrew Carnegie again. As a boy in Scotland, he caught a rabbit that turned out to be pregnant, and suddenly had a nest of young rabbits and nothing to feed them. So he gathered the neighborhood children and offered them a deal. Bring clover and dandelions, and he'd name a rabbit after you. It worked perfectly, and he never forgot why. Decades later, trying to win a railroad contract, he built a new steel plant in Pittsburgh and named it after the president of the railroad he was selling to. When the Pennsylvania Railroad needed steel rails, the man had a factory carrying his own name sitting there ready to supply them. A person's own name is the single most important word in the language to them, and treating it as unimportant is one of the most common small insults in professional life. 4. Be a good listener. Encourage people to talk about themselves. Carnegie describes a dinner party where he was seated next to a botanist. He had never spoken to a botanist in his life, so he asked questions, and then he sat there, genuinely absorbed, for hours, through exotic plants, indoor gardens, and the humble potato, of which he apparently learned more that evening than he'd known existed. He barely said a word about himself. At the end of the night, the botanist turned to their host and described Carnegie as a most stimulating conversationalist. He had contributed almost nothing to the conversation. He had listened with his entire attention, and that alone was experienced as brilliance. The uncomfortable implication is worth sitting with. The person you found most impressive this year probably said less than you did. And the reason listening reads as charm is the same reason appreciation does. Hardly anyone actually does it. Most people are not listening. They are waiting, assembling their next sentence, watching for the gap. Carnegie's blunt version of this is that if you want people to avoid you, never listen for long, talk constantly about yourself, and interrupt whenever you have a thought, which is a fairly accurate description of a great many meetings. 5. Talk in terms of the other person's interests. Theodore Roosevelt's staff noticed that whoever was coming to see him, Roosevelt seemed to know their subject. The reason was unglamorous. The night before, he sat up reading about whatever that person cared about. That's not charisma. That's homework, which is good news because homework is available to everyone. 6. Make the other person feel important, and do it sincerely. That word sincerely is carrying the entire load, and Carnegie repeats it constantly, because he knew exactly how the book would be misread. His illustration is deliberately small. Standing in a post office queue, waiting to register a letter, he noticed the clerk behind the counter was bored out of his mind, weighing envelopes, stamping, handing back change, year after year. So Carnegie decided to find something he genuinely admired about the man, which is harder than it sounds when you've known someone for 11 seconds. He settled on the clerk's head of hair and said so, warmly, and meant it. The man looked up. His whole face changed. They had a short, pleased conversation, and Carnegie walked out having made someone's afternoon better at a cost of nothing at all. The point is not that compliments are a technique, it's the observation underneath. Almost every human being you meet is quietly convinced they're worth more than the world has noticed. Behave as though that's true, because it usually is, and you become one of the very few people who ever made them feel it. This is the longest part of the book, and the most useful in an office. 1. The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. Carnegie describes a banquet where the man next to him confidently attributed a quotation to the Bible. Carnegie knew it was Shakespeare, and said so. The man insisted. Carnegie turned to a friend at the table, a Shakespeare scholar, who kicked him under the table and said the other man was right. Afterwards, Carnegie asked him what on earth that was about. The answer was simple. The man wasn't asking for information. Nobody had anything to gain from being corrected at a dinner party. Why humiliate him to win a point neither of them was being paid for? You can win an argument and lose the person. And a person who has lost an argument still believes exactly what they believed before, only now with an injury attached. 2. Show respect for the other person's opinions. Never say, "You're wrong." Those two words end the possibility of persuasion in the sentence they appear in. Everything after them is heard as attack. 3. If you're wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically. Carnegie's insight here is almost mischievous. When you condemn yourself first, and thoroughly, there's nothing left for anyone else to do. The other person's only remaining move is to be generous. Beat them to your own criticism, and you frequently walk away with more standing than you had. 4. Begin in a friendly way. A drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. If someone's mind is closed, no amount of correct reasoning gets in. You have to open the door before you send anything through it. 5. Get the other person saying yes immediately. This is the Socratic method with the philosophy removed. Start with what you already agree on. Emphasize the shared goal. Every small yes builds momentum, and a person who has agreed 4 times finds the 5th agreement psychologically easy, where a person who said no once tends to defend that no out of pure consistency. 6. Let the other person do most of the talking. Nearly everyone talks too much when they want something. Ask, then stop. Let the silence sit. People fill silence with the information you needed. 7. Let the other person feel the idea is theirs. Carnegie's example is an equipment salesman who couldn't get a hospital to buy his machine. He stopped selling. Instead, he wrote to the head of the department saying his company had developed something new, they knew it was imperfect, and would this man, whose judgment they respected, be willing to look at it and tell them how to improve it? He was invited in immediately. The doctor took the idea on as his own and bought the machine because he had decided to. Nobody likes being sold to. Everybody likes their own conclusions. 8. Try honestly to see things from the other person's point of view. Not as a courtesy, as intelligence gathering. There is always a reason the other person believes what they believe, and finding it is more useful than proving them wrong. 9. Be sympathetic with the other person's ideas and desires. Carnegie offers a sentence he says will stop arguments and dissolve bad feeling. I don't blame you at all for feeling as you do. If I were you, I'd feel exactly the same. You can say that to almost anyone, and it costs nothing, and it's usually true. 10. Appeal to nobler motives. People act for 2 reasons, the real one and the one that sounds good. Give them the flattering reason, and they'll frequently rise to it. Carnegie's example is a landlord with a tenant threatening to break his lease. Instead of citing the contract, he told the man he'd judged him to be someone who kept his word, and gave him the choice. The tenant stayed. 11. Dramatize your ideas. Facts alone bounce off people. Carnegie's example is a cash register salesman who couldn't convince a shopkeeper his old register was costing him money until he stood in the doorway and dropped coins on the ground, one after another, while explaining that this was what was happening every day. The shopkeeper bought a new register. He'd heard the argument before. He'd never watched it. 12. Throw down a challenge. Charles Schwab again, with a mill that was underperforming. At the end of the day shift, he asked how many heats the crew had made, was told 6, and chalked a large 6 on the floor without another word. The night shift arrived, asked what it meant, and rubbed it out and wrote 7. The day shift came back the next morning and wrote 10. Nobody was threatened. Nobody was paid more. The desire to win, when the game is fair and visible, does more than most incentives. The last part is about leadership, how to correct someone without making an enemy. 1. Begin with praise and honest appreciation. 2. Call attention to mistakes indirectly. And Carnegie makes a small point here that is genuinely one of the most practical things in the book. Listen to the word connecting your praise to your criticism. If it's but, everything before it is canceled and heard as a setup. Change it to and the sentence becomes an encouragement instead of a trap. You've improved enormously this term, but if you'd worked harder at maths, you've improved enormously this term, and if you keep that up, maths will come along with it. Same information. Completely different experience. 3. Talk about your own mistakes first. Correcting someone from an admitted position of imperfection is a very different act from correcting them from above. 4. Ask questions instead of giving direct orders. What do you think of this? Rather than do this, an order removes the other person's involvement. A question keeps it. 5. Let the other person save face. Carnegie treats this as close to a moral obligation, and his example is a company that had to release a large number of staff every year once the busy season ended. The standard approach was brisk. You were told the work had dried up, you understood the arrangement when you took the job, and that was that. People left humiliated and carried it. One manager changed the conversation entirely. He brought each person in, thanked them for the specific work they'd done, told them honestly that the firm was proud of how they'd handled a difficult stretch, and made clear that the ending was about the calendar and not about them. The same people lost the same jobs, but they left with their standing intact, and when the season turned again, they came back. You can be entirely right and still take something from someone that they don't recover from. A few minutes of thought about how a person will feel walking out of the room costs almost nothing, and it is the single most neglected item on this list. 6. Praise every improvement, however small. Wait for excellence, and you'll never praise anything, because people don't arrive at excellence, they approach it. 7. Give the other person a reputation to live up to. Tell someone they're reliable, and you make being unreliable an act of self-contradiction. 8. Make the fault seem easy to correct. Tell someone they're hopeless at something, and you've removed their reason to try. Tell them they're close, and the effort suddenly has a payoff attached. 9. Make the other person happy about doing what you suggest, which is the whole book compressed into one line. Find the version of your request that the other person actually wants to say yes to. Now come back to that $100 in cash. There's a detail in Buffett's account of the course that's easy to skim past. He said the class met once a week for around a dozen weeks, and that the whole group of them, 30 adults, struggled to say their own names out loud. These were not unusual people. They were the normal distribution, a room full of adults who were competent at their jobs and terrified of being looked at. And this is what makes the Buffett story worth more than the usual celebrity endorsement. He's not a natural. He was a socially awkward 15-year-old who found a book on a shelf and a 20-something who canceled a check out of fear. Whatever he has now was assembled deliberately, from instructions, over years. He's also said something about this that's worth taking seriously as career advice. He's argued that being able to communicate raises your value substantially, that in graduate school you learn a great deal of complicated material, and the thing that actually determines outcomes is whether you can get other people to come with you. The reason his certificate is on the wall and his Columbia degree isn't is not sentiment. It's an accurate assessment of which one moved the needle. Now, the charge against this book, which has been made since it appeared, and which you should take seriously, the accusation is that it teaches manipulation, that it's a manual for appearing to care in order to get things, a set of techniques for extracting cooperation from people while feeling nothing. And the honest answer is that it can absolutely be used that way. Every principle here works whether your intent is good or not. Remembering someone's name works on people you're about to defraud. So does listening. So does appealing to their better nature. The techniques don't check your motives at the door. Carnegie saw this coming and hammered on the word sincere in principle after principle, insisting that appreciation and flattery are different things and that people detect the difference eventually. That's a real defense, and it's also a slightly convenient one, because it puts the responsibility entirely on the reader. There's a second criticism I think is stronger and gets discussed less. Some of this advice is actively bad in specific settings. Avoid arguments is sound guidance at a dinner party and dangerous in a hospital, an engineering review, or a boardroom deciding something expensive. There are rooms where the most valuable person is the one willing to say the unwelcome thing, and a culture where everyone has read Carnegie and nobody wants to be disagreeable is a culture that walks into avoidable disasters. The modern research on why teams fail points in almost exactly the opposite direction. The safety to disagree openly is what makes groups perform. Then there's the context. This is a 1930s American book, written for salesmen and junior managers, and it assumes a world where everyone you're dealing with is operating in reasonable good faith. Applied to someone acting in bad faith, several of these principles just hand them the initiative. So here's how I'd read it. Treat the first two parts as close to unimprovable, genuine interest, real attention, remembering people, appreciating what's actually good. That material has aged extremely well, and later research has largely backed it. Treat Part 3 as powerful and situational. Know when to deploy it and when the room needs someone to disagree. And take Carnegie's insistence on sincerity as the actual instruction rather than a disclaimer. Not because insincerity is wrong in some abstract sense, but because it has a short shelf life. The techniques get you through the first few conversations. Nothing except actually caring gets you through the 50th. One last thought about that wall in Omaha. The 2 degrees not hanging there represent something like 6 years of education and a great deal of money. The certificate that is hanging there represents 12 evenings in a rented room, learning to stand up and speak without being sick. That's the trade the whole book is pointing at. Most of us spend enormous effort becoming more competent, and almost none becoming easier to work with, and then we're surprised when the competence doesn't convert. Carnegie's real claim is not that these are tricks. It's that the ability to handle people is a skill, in the ordinary sense, something nobody is born with, something that can be practiced deliberately, and something most people never practice at all because they assume you either have it or you don't. A 15-year-old who couldn't fit in at high school read that claim, decided to test it, and spent the next 70 years compounding the result. So here's my question for you. Which of these 30 do you already know you're bad at? Not the ones you disagree with. The one you read and felt a small flinch of recognition because you did it last week. Put it in the comments. That thread is always the most honest one under these videos. If this gave you something worth sitting with, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We break down one great book like this every week. The people who seem naturally good with others are mostly people who decided to get good at it. Stay sharp. I'll see you in the next one.